Our favorite order of business, our green themes presentation. This evening we have with us Paul Dykema from the Visiting Arborists. Welcome and thank you for coming, and looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time, and thanks for inviting me. I am the owner of the Visiting Arborists. My information's up on your screen there. I was 33 years as a municipal forester. Some of it in New Mexico, most of it here in mid-Michigan. I'm a native of mid-Michigan. I spent 27 years with Lansing. Over that entire time, I was responsible for their municipal forestry program. So I've got a bit of experience at it in the mid-Michigan area. I was also a member of the Michigan Forestry and Parks Association Board of Directors. Society of Municipal Arborists, which is an international organization. I served on their board of directors as well as their president. I'm currently consulting with municipalities, property owners regarding tree risk assessment, tree valuations, plant health care, tree preservation, and really anything to do with a municipal tree. The question that a lot of people ask is, what do you plant and where? And if somebody else were here, I would talk about a professor who once told me that when he started in the profession, he'd list off 4 different species, 5 different species just like that, and those were the set ones that would be the ones that you use. 25 years later, his response is, okay. It's stuck.
Figures, you know. We should be able to.
Okay.
There we go.
Yep, there we go. It depends. It depends. It depends on a lot of different things, a lot of different site factors. What do I mean by site factors? Well, there aren't 2 sites in mid-Michigan that are the same. And to say that, you know, these are 4 or 5 different species that are going to be so adaptable that they're going to be the best on all of them just isn't true. Soil pH is a major issue for a lot of trees. Is your soil very alkaline, pH of over 8? Is it very acidic, under 5 or 6? That has a great deal to do with how well the tree's going to do there. And you need to select your trees for planting based on what your soil pH is. For example, if I were to use a red maple in an alkaline soil, I'd be wasting my money. It's not going to grow very well. It's going to suffer from nutrient deficiencies, and nobody's going to be happy, including the tree. And so most trees, unfortunately, like to have a pH someplace between 6 or 6.5 up to about 7.5 for pH, with 7 being a neutral kind of a soil pH. And unfortunately, a whole lot of our soils are 7 to 8, 8.5 for pH. And so you can see that you want to put in something, or at least know what kind of soil you're dealing with before you start, so that you can pick something that's going to be adapted to that kind of a soil pH and that chemistry. Another issue is soil type. Sandy soil, your roots are going to go deeper, which is a good thing, but you're not going to have a lot of organic matter in it. And you're going to have to put on extra fertilizers, and you're going to have to put on extra water in a lot of situations. Versus a clay soil, which can get so rock hard and so impenetrable to root systems that they literally stay on the surface and interrupt, by the way, anything else that happens to be in the vicinity. So you have to know what kind of a soil type you're dealing with. What's the density? When we're building things, the builders have a tendency to pack down the soil, make it just as hard as possible so that they can run water off, and so that there isn't heaving underneath sidewalks, roadways, parking lots, and that kind of thing. Well, that is not what trees are adapted to. Trees are adapted to forest kinds of situations where the soil is a lot less dense than that, and they can penetrate and get the nutrients, water, that they need from a lower level. And so, you know, soil density is something that's very important. We did some soil density tests on Potter Park when we had an independent consultant come in from Bartlett Tree Lab. And we wanted to have that done because we'd seen the tree so many times. We were thinking maybe we were getting into a group think kind of a situation. And we wanted somebody else to come in who was at least our skill level, if not better, and take a look at the situation. And they did some bulk density tests on the soil there, and it was approaching that of concrete. So, you know, over the 70 or 80 years that the park had been in existence, it had just been packed down that much. Roads had been moved or removed, and that's what we were trying to grow trees in. Site size. If there's a building sitting there or a courtyard where you're going to put the tree, that really restricts your site size. I know a landscape architect who, you know, in his first couple of months designed this nice residential landscape, only to find out that the day that his installer was calling him out and pointing at that 2-inch bald and burlap tree and telling him to try and get it into that courtyard that they just surrounded with a house, you know, it's a very restricted site. So site and size is really very important. Most of what I dealt with as a municipal arborist was objects. Now this is an American elm. It's one of the brand new ones. It's growing like a weed, sometimes 2-3 feet a year. This thing has really surprised us. And I'm afraid it's going to overgrow that site because that's only about 8 feet from curb to sidewalk there. And the tree is 7 years old now, and we planted it bare root. That tree is a very happy tree. And I think that it's going to end up moving the sidewalk and moving the curb just because the trunk is going to get big enough that the roots are going to, you know, do something like 8 inches, 10 inches across and begin to move things. So we learned from that. Now here's a honey locust. I think that the soils are very compacted. You can see from looking at that sidewalk that the sidewalk is already lifted 2 to 3 inches. And the tree is really a fairly young tree still. So it's going to create havoc with that particular sidewalk for a very long time to come. Do we want to have that kind of expense with replacing that every 15 to 20 years? Well, that's a question to be asked. This is a London plane, it's a sycamore tree, which is a kissing cousin of a London plane tree. And they will get to be gigantic. They can go 80, 90 feet in height with a diameter on that trunk that'll easily take up that entire curb to sidewalk space plus some. I didn't plant that. I'm glad. But it's going to cause a lot of trouble there. The sidewalk was there first in this instance. I know the site. And the tree is going to rearrange everything around it in a few years. So you want to think about things like that when you're doing a street tree planting. Interestingly enough, there's some close cousins of this tree in Lansing, and we can't figure out quite what the species is. We called a certain dendrology professor I know of and asked him what they were, and he didn't know. We called some curators of the MSU tree collection. When he was in town one day, he stopped by there, and he didn't know what they are. So I didn't feel bad about it. I even talked to the people who put them in the 1940s and 50s. They attended some of our Christmas parties, and they thought that they were London plane trees at that time. And just something showed up and got off the truck. And beautiful, beautiful trees, but we don't know how to reorder them at this point, unfortunately. Silver maples also get big. They get very big. Now, in this case, I don't know what its initial situation was. Nobody builds a road like that. Nobody builds a road that is that far down from the adjacent sidewalk. So I suspect that that road has been changed quite a bit since that tree was planted. But you can see that on the right there, the sidewalk's been replaced fairly recently. There's a definite color difference. And then right in the middle of the replacement, there appears to be another patch. And so this tree is causing problems there, or the situation is changed such that the tree is having problems with the site. And you'll kind of hear me hedge my bets a lot of times on whether or not it's a tree problem or a site problem or whose problem it is. Because when that tree was planted, I was not even a gleam in my dad's eye. And I dare say that the road has changed several times and the sidewalk has changed several times. It might have been that when the tree was put in, it was a perfectly fine tree for the site, and the site has changed. So you'll hear me kind of hedge my bets sometimes. I won't here. This tree has lifted that sidewalk several times. That's now an asphalt patch in front of somebody's house. They're going to wait until the area is totally redone before they do any more patching there, and then I suspect that that tree will get cut down and replaced with something that fits the site a little bit better. This is a honey locust tree right next to a sidewalk. You can see that that sidewalk's up a good 3 or 4 inches at this point. Not something that we desire. The tree's going to continue to grow very well on the site. Its root system is in good condition. The tree is growing rapidly, but it needs to have a good 10 foot, 12 foot across between the sidewalk and the curb in order to not cause this kind of trouble. There are a whole lot of them up and down Michigan Avenue that are just raising Cain with all the sidewalks in that section or in that roadway. And they were placed there because, to be honest with you, nothing else was going to grow there. This is one of the toughest trees. It can fix its own nitrogen. That is, it doesn't need any fungi or bacteria in the soil in order to get its own nitrogen. It can do it itself. All the other trees, this is a legume, but anything else needs some help. The sites are rock hard, and the only thing that can grow in that kind of condition probably is a honey locust in this area. So that's what was planted. This is a tree that is beginning to get used in the nursery industry. It's called a golden rain tree. That's not a spelling error. It is all one word. It's golden rain tree. It gets bright yellow flowers in August, followed by this kind of paper lantern type seed pod that disintegrates in October or so. This tree probably, and I'm going to say probably because there aren't any mature ones in mid-Michigan, this tree will probably get to maybe 40 feet in height at the maximum, I would guess. We've put in a couple of hundred of them. They're doing very well. They withstood 26 below zero. They withstood an ice storm. They've withstood a lot of snow. And at the same time, they withstand the summer heat. I know this tree. I ran into it in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it can stand 100 plus. So it's very adaptable, it seems. And this tree is growing very well. This tree will grow just about anywhere, too. It's a bald cypress. Give it lots and lots and lots of room. Lots of room. That root system is really aggressive. My boss was trying to get me to plant one of these nice little evergreen trees out in front of his house because there was one around the corner from him. And I told him we're not using those anymore. And he said, well, why not? I said, well, you got 30 minutes? I'll show you. He said, okay. So off we went. And I pulled up in front of a house, and the tree was 50 feet tall. And he looked out, and I said, does that to every single yard. And for about 10 feet out from the trunk, the yard was wood. Just wood. So when we were going to have to cut that down, I was going to have to send a stump grinder and grind out about a 20-foot radius on that tree. And he decided that perhaps he didn't want to have that in front of his yard or in his yard. But they're very adaptable. They can certainly handle wet areas very well. That's what they're native to. That's the only reason we moved them so far north. They were growing in drainage areas in the southern parts of Ohio and Illinois, Indiana, and that's traditionally where cold air pockets also form. So we suspected that they could handle the cold weather of mid-Michigan, and in fact they can. This is another picture of the golden rain tree. Again, nice oval kind of outline to its crown. Can get a bit irregular, that is kind of scattered, but it's easily pruned, responds well to pruning. And so this is not an unusual form for it at all. It's a very attractive tree. This is a Katsura tree with a K, Katsura. Happens to be a columnar form of it, that is, it's very tight. It's got an excellent growth form. It's got a centralized leader on it with all the main branches coming off of that leader, ex-current growth form. Can grow into narrow areas, and you can prune it up easily. This is a linden. You notice the density of the crown casting that shade. A lot of people have trouble with that. A lot of people also have troubles with its cousin, a basswood, during flower season because the bees will really come after the flowers. People don't understand that when the bees are foraging for pollen, they're not particularly aggressive. They just know that they've been stung at some point in life, and they don't want that. Put it and have it grow in front of a daycare in somebody's house, and you'll get calls very regularly about it. They finally actually got used to it and don't call anymore. Never had an issue with anybody getting stung either. I think they kept the kids in the backyard, to be honest. But at any rate, as somebody is backing out of that driveway, can they see in this direction? No, not very well. Not very well. So you've got to pay attention to where drivers need visibility. And in this instance, that driver has to either stop when he's way up on the sidewalk so that he can see, or he has to back it entirely into the street so that he can see past that particular tree. Not good placement. And the trunk will only continue to get larger. It's not unusual for the lindens and basswoods to have a trunk 28 inches in diameter. Not unusual at all. People did this one right. The stop sign is there. The honey locust tree is behind it. That is farther towards the property. With just a little bit of pruning, this stop sign would be clear, visible, without any kind of an obstruction. So it's very, very good placement for the stop sign. This stop sign is also clearly visible. The tree is probably 45 feet from it. You're going to be able to see that stop sign for a long, long distance down the road. Very good. This is a little different. And you'd ordinarily say, well, where's the stop sign? Well, from here you can't see it, but it's close enough to you so that they're putting up a stop ahead sign. So what happened? Well, what happened was that the transportation engineers decided that they didn't want any through roads that didn't have a stop sign every 2 blocks. And so they went into a lot of the neighborhoods and they switched them all. And so the people who had planted the trees 40 or 50 years ago kind of get the blame for having trees in the wrong places. I don't defend that they were planting them near corners, but at the same time, they didn't do that. That's just a little bit difficult even for me to see, and I'm a proponent of trees. This one's just as bad. It's actually not the same tree and not the same situation. Again, very difficult to see that stop sign. This one, however, this Norway maple, has been pruned up, and it's far enough from that stop sign so that the sign is easily visible from a great distance, and there's no problems with this kind of situation. It's only about 20 or 25 feet back from that tree, but the tree's been pruned enough and pruned up enough so that the stop sign is clearly visible. At some point in time, that probably wasn't quite so visible, and so you need to consider that. This is a Crimson King Norway maple. A lot of people know this tree, like it, because it's just a very pretty red kind of coloration to it. Eventually, that street light will be useful again, but again, it's going to take quite a bit of pruning for that Norway maple to be up out of the way and anything to the far, to allow light from that street light to the far side of it. I would have preferred that the tree be planted about 15 feet further down. There's space for it, at least at this point. There may have been something else there, I don't know. at some point in history, but it would have been better off if that tree had been down a little bit further away from that light. Yes.
In that situation, maybe you do know, maybe you don't. Which came first, the tree or the light?
I can't tell you. I don't know whether this tree came first or the light came first. I suspect that it was the light.
That came first.
Mm-hmm. But I don't honestly recall. This is a situation where the street light is, or the traffic control light is very visible from a great distance. This is a good situation. There are situations in mid-Michigan where that's not necessarily so visible. We all want to be able to see those lights. That means that there is a major intersection, and if you run the light, bad things are liable to happen to you. And so that's something that really has to take precedent. You've got to pay a great deal of attention to where those lights are. Does anybody think there's a power line issue here? I'm a member of the National Arbor Day Foundation. Just on general principles, I am. And they'd send me a monthly newsletter, and I'd usually take a look at the cover of it and then file it. And one day I looked at what they had sent to me, and they had a picture, and it said, "Wrong tree, wrong spot." And there was this situation where the gigantic tree had overgrown this set of primary power lines, which are the things that are up on the tops of those poles. And I looked at it, something was wrong. I said, hold it. When that tree was planted, there was no such thing as a primary power line. I've seen pictures. They didn't exist. And so I wrote to the editor, and I figured, well, I'll put in my 2 cents worth, and I mentioned to him that, that tree really, he's saying that the tree shouldn't have been planted underneath those power lines, and I pointed out that the power lines weren't there when that tree was planted. And I figured out, well, I've put in my 2 cents worth. And they wrote back to me and said, "You're right, we will redraw that to more accurately represent what we're trying to convey." So in this case, you can see those gigantic power poles. Power companies aren't putting those in for fun. They're trying to go over something. Well, they're trying to go over those trees. The trees were there first, before those primary power lines were. So, when we're looking at these situations and we look back on them and say, well, let's not accuse the homeowner or the arborist until we've really looked at things a little bit and figured out what's going on. But in this case, the Board of Water and Light was going over a set of very large trees that were there. This situation's got a lot of things going on. It's got a set of power lines up there, and they're pruning around it. It's unfortunately, they're not real visible up there. But you notice that the tree is also cockeyed. And if you can't see it real well, but the sidewalk down on the right is also lifted a little bit, and it's brand new. The tree had shifted. And how can I tell the tree has shifted? Well, the sidewalk's up a little bit, but that's not the only thing. That tree is straight, but it's off center. If a tree shifts, it's up like this and moves like this, first thing it's going to do is grow to light, so it's going to sweep upward. It's going to curve. What was there at the time of the shift will still be straight, but the new growth will be curved. Anybody see a curve on that? Not really much of a curve on it. So the tree has shifted within the last few years at this point, and really deserves a lot of attention on the part of the arborists that are managing it. They know about it. This is an intersection. Good example of how to plant around an intersection. Create a clear line of sight, just so people can see each other. Give them a good distance so that they have a chance. If somebody's making a mistake, the other person can respond. This one's got trees over on the far roadway. You can still see very, very well whether or not there's a vehicle there. This isn't so good. On the left, there's a hawthorn that has decided to send up some root sprouts. The owner's not keeping them pruned back. City's not keeping them pruned back. On the right, there's a blue spruce that's kind of low. You can see a little bit under it, but it's kind of low. And then there's a tree trunk on the far side of things. So this is really kind of a restricted vision situation. And pruning is necessary in this kind of a location so that the drivers can see more at that intersection. Now this is a swamp white oak. It's in a pretty good spot for it. Swamp white oak get to be about 45 foot tall, maybe a little bit bigger. Its parent, the general species, is a bit bigger than that. So you kind of think that this is going to be that size. A lot of the municipal arborists, and we spoke with people over the years as we were looking at their trees that were creating problems, and the people said, you know, I told those guys when they planted it back in 19 whatever that it wasn't good, this wasn't a good spot for a big tree. And the arborist said, well, the tree is, the site's so restricted, the tree's not going to get big. Ordinarily, you know, first couple of times I dismissed it, but when we heard it time after time after time after time, we kind of think that maybe that's what the arborist thought at the time, was that the sites were so restricted that the tree would respond by being stunted. A lot of times the tree won. A lot of times the tree won. Enough times so that you really ought to plan on that happening. This is a linden. We've talked about them before, but this kind of shows the form of the European lindens. They're a pretty good street tree. Need to make sure you get them planted at the right depth. If you don't, they'll have root sprouts that'll show up. We planted everything bare root, so we had a really good idea as where we should plant it, how deep we should plant it. I like that much, much better than the bald and burlap trees that we get. Just because you can see what the proper depth of planting is. A lot of the production methods in the nurseries end up piling some soil up next to the tree trunk. And so while you may take a look at the tree and you get a tree that's a good 2.5 inches diameter, you don't know if that's at 6 inches above where the root system really starts or a foot. And if it's a foot above and you're paying for all of this soil that's around it, all you've got is soil. You don't have root. Root's needed for that tree. And so you want to be able to see some root flare at the top of the bald and burlap trees before you buy something like that. Well, if we're doing bare root plantings, you can see that. It's very obvious. I mean, you've got the root system, you've got the point where the flares are, you've got usually a line on the trunk that was obviously the point where, you know, above that was above ground and below that was below ground. So it's really very obvious. And it's not that hard to do. Timing is critical and action's critical. You can't just let them sit in the backyard and before you plant them. The same day you get them is the day you should plant them. Ornamental pear tree, very popular. This one happens to have quite a bit of space around it. That's a good idea. Just a word of caution about the ornamental pear trees. Once they get to be 15, 16 inches, 18 inches across in diameter, they begin to fall apart. So the trunks will get to be, you know, yay kind of diameter, and all of a sudden you'll begin to lose limbs in it that are like this falling out on you. Not quite sure why, but they don't seem to be very well connected. I haven't shown you any evergreen trees as street trees. You saw the bald cypress. Bald cypress is deciduous. No evergreen trees are street trees. Why? Well, that was taken not too far from where I live. That happens all winter long. That shade is there. In order to melt the ice off of that road, we need sunlight. That is perpetually an ice patch. And so if you can imagine what the havoc would be if that were out on a collector type street or even a busy residential street, that would cause quite a bit of problem. And so it really kind of discourage the use of evergreens as street trees, particularly on the south side of the road where they will absolutely interrupt with the penetration of sunlight in the wintertime. This is what we're all after. And with a little bit of thought and planning, that's what we can get. Are there any questions? Have at me.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you say a word or two about tree injection? We had a pine tree that was on its last legs, got it injected, and within a year it was back, which I hadn't heard about it until, I mean, we ran into it by accident, but they're doing tree injections to take quite a bit of tree blight. So I'm just curious.
There are a lot of...
Repeat that question for the recording.
Sure. The question was if I could just talk very briefly about tree injections. It's something that's been around in the industry for some time now, but it's not widely used. We can inject nutrients directly into the trunk. We can put implants into the trunk that have nutrients in them. We can put insecticides directly into the trunk through injections. So it really is something that can and is being used. It's a little bit more expensive than the spray that you have or the fertilizer that you have, but at the same time, you know that it's hitting the target that you have, and you know that it's going to be there for a while. So in certain circumstances, injection is really quite beneficial. We were using tree injections of insecticides to save some of our largest ash trees. In some cases, those injections would be effective for 3 to 4 years. Same way with some of the old American elms. Some of the tree injections there could be effective for 2 to 3 years. Now, of course, we have some selected American elms that seem to be quite resistant to Dutch elm disease, and so those are the trees that are now being used in place of just the standard American elms.
Okay, other questions from commissioners? You actually addressed one of my 2 questions, which had to do with the relationship between the tree canopy and the longevity of the asphalt.
Mm-hmm.
And your explanation makes a lot of sense to me. It seems from my observations that even the deciduous trees have poorer asphalt underneath them than the adjoining parts of the road. So they're, I guess, just the branches are also intercepting enough sunlight in the wintertime to reduce the melting. Is that how
Well,
I
and
understand
anytime you have a shade next to sunlit, you have a temperature differential.
Mm-hmm.
And in asphalt, that spells expansion and contraction at different rates, and so you end up with cracks.
Right.
And the water can get in the cracks, and when it gets cold enough, it freezes and expands and causes deterioration of the roadway.
So
Or
when
the
I-
asphalt in
When
general.
I put that in the
Parking lot or
context of
wherever.
your very last slide, where you said this is what we're after, which was basically a closed canopy over the roadway, I'm trying to understand, there are some benefits to having that canopy and there's some disbenefit.
Yes, there are. That's true.
So how do you weigh those?
I weigh it from the property owner's perspective. That adds a lot of property value to that street. It also cools the environment greatly. And in that situation, it had so much shaded area that, yes, it could be slippery during the wintertime, but the roads were holding up pretty well because all of it was shaded.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question I had for you, I think it must have been about 10 years ago that I read an editorial, maybe by John Schneider, about Midwesterners' love for building up the land around their trees, creating topography by mulching around their trees. And I've since heard MSU arborists talking about some of the problems that happen when we mulch heavily around trees in terms of the root behavior. I wonder if you could address that.
Certainly. There are a couple of, there's pros and cons to mulching. You're asking me to talk about the cons. Lots of times the mulch is put in what I'll almost, looks like a kind of a pyramid up next to the tree. Well, the trunk of the tree is not used to being underneath mulch or an organic material. And that section of the tree is serving a different function than to just be support. It's also doing air exchange and things like that. And once you've put a nice moist environment in there, you end up with fungi and insects and everything else attacking a section of the tree that would not normally be buried. There's some exceptions. I mean, you get into the wetland species where they have annual floods that are liable to dump all sorts of silt on it. It doesn't make that much difference to it, but that happens on a lot of trees. And you see it consistently where people are just mounding it up as if it were a pyramid around it. You really ought to leave the mulch back 3 or 4 inches if they're going to be using it. Another situation that is happening is that, and particularly if the soils are a little bit on the poorish side or dense, the root systems are restricting themselves to the mulched area. And so even though you're getting a big mulched area, perhaps as much as 5 or 6 feet across, 7 feet across, all of a sudden you've got a very restricted root zone because of the difference between the mulched area and the hard soil that's around it. And so that can really be quite a challenge.
In the case that I was seeing, these were plane trees, and they were actually creating new roots crossing the old roots. And it was explained to me that they were actually strangling some of the older roots as they were making their way, taking advantage of this soft mulched area. And they were actually carving these new roots away after they removed the mulch.
And that certainly is goes along with what I was saying, that there's such a vigorous growth in there and it's restricted. And the roots just get so dense and begin to cross each other. And you'll see it particularly in Norway maples, but you can see it in plane trees, sugar maples, and other things. But the root system will actually begin to just strangle the tree. And it doesn't do that to start out with, and it's not literally doing it. But the root system will begin to grow sideways and things like that. And all of a sudden, as the trunk is expanding, it runs into this root. And the root's not moving, and the trunk's going to continue to expand. And before you know it, the trunk is literally being cut in half by the root that is there. And so, you ended up with a strangled tree kind of situation. And that can happen in any kind of situation, particularly if you've got a restricted root system. I mean, it happens in any tree. It's just a matter of how far and how many roots are involved. But if you have a restricted zone, all of a sudden it can happen a lot. If the root system is able to grow, you've got one over here, one over there, one over there, it doesn't really matter much. But they can literally strangle themselves by doing that.
Along the lines of that whole issue of the root system being sort of directed by the availability of nutrients and the compaction of the soil, is there any way of, and you were talking about, you showed us lots of examples of heaved sidewalks, and for people who ride bicycles, sometimes that's an issue. For people who ride around in assistive vehicles, it's really an issue. And it also strongly affects people plowing sidewalks because you've got a panel that's lifted up and they have to lift up their blade or else they damage their equipment, etc. I've had several conversations with our township director, Frank Walsh, about these things because how do you get sidewalks plowed if they're heaved? Anyway, I was just wondering if there's any way to either sort of direct the growth paths of roots. Obviously, you described places as being restrictive, so it's obviously possible for the natural situation, or at least the situation the tree lands in, to direct the roots. Is it possible to, for example, drill holes that you fill with richer nutrients that encourage the tree to grow its roots downward, for example, rather than out and under a sidewalk?
Even more effective is just to put in a deflector plate at an angle back underneath the sidewalk.
Sure, okay.
But you have to do that when the sidewalk is going in and the tree's not necessarily there yet.
Yeah.
More appropriately is to make sure that the compaction isn't an issue and that you're putting in a tree that isn't going to necessarily be so aggressive or grow to such a large size that it has issues. Lots of times we can bridge roots that are causing trouble, but do it with the knowledge that the root's going to continue to expand in size, and eventually it's going to lift whatever's on top of it.
The other question I had was, again, you raised the issue of visibility, of course, that's huge. How sensitive are trees? I mean, if you prune from down below and sort of push the crown up so that the sort of first 10 feet or 15 feet, whatever is needed for good visibility, is cut away, are there trees that are more or less sensitive to that kind of pruning? And that would or would not, regrow that? I mean, I'm just asking how much control
Sure.
can you exert over their shape?
Quick rule of thumb is that you can prune it to about half its height. Very quick rule of thumb. So if you have a
More or less any tree?
20-foot tall tree, you can go to 10 feet on it.
Oh,
Pruning is really a kind of a constant thing, lifelong type operation. You want to keep a centralized, that is the tallest part of the tree, it should be in the middle, and the major limb should be coming off of that tall piece. It's a stronger structure, and it also makes it a lot easier to prune it up out of the way of everything as opposed to having flat limbs going out all over the place. There are a lot of trees that are not suited to be street trees. Something that comes to mind is a Mary Potter crabapple that just basically grows out flat. And that's something that's literally impossible to keep out of the way. So you want to select your species so that you can do that, and so that you've got the right species on the right site in order to be able to do those clearances eventually. But yeah, basically, you can prune them up to about half of their height. All the maples will stand. Any one of the big trees are going to be able to stand that.
okay. Thank you.
Well, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you whether you've noticed or whether you foresee changes in species selection as Michigan's climate changes.
Well, we have foreseen it. And I think that the nursery industry is foreseeing it. My predecessor's predecessor's predecessor noticed he had a problem, and he decided that they weren't going to plant more than one block all in one species. My predecessor saw that, well, that isn't working for crap. We've got elm trees dead all over the place, and we're having a lot of trouble. We're not going to plant another tree next to another species, we're not going to plant two trees together that are the same species. And we're going to do 4 genera per block. And that was a good idea. That was a real good idea. Because when we lost the ash trees, like everybody did, we only lost about 4,000 out of 40,000. And so that was a lot better than a lot of communities did. You also have situations where we're seeing increased summertime scorch on trees. And it's not just from temperatures, it's from drought periods where you get really hot and really dry for prolonged periods of time. For instance, this year it didn't rain in July and August. It just didn't happen. And so, those kinds of things are going to become more prevalent, and they are becoming more prevalent. If you take a look at the growth hardiness zones, everybody know what I'm talking about? No, okay. Each and every tree has its own growth hardiness. How cold a temperature can it stand? And it occupies a great deal of our time, making sure that you put the right species in weather conditions that it can survive. It's dumb to bring a tree from Alabama to Michigan and think that it's going to survive a winter. Even the bald cypresses we were restricting had to come from southern Ohio and Illinois. And so temperature, trees are temperamental to temperature. Every plant is temperamental to temperature. You're not going to grow St. Augustine grass in Michigan. It's not going to work for you. And so they have come up with what they call growth zones based on minimum temperature. And there are enough weather stations around the country so they can do that pretty accurately. And it used to be that Lansing, this little itty bitty spot in mid-Michigan, was different than the rest of the area around it. Apparently we were a little bit colder. We were a growth zone 4. Clearly now we are growth zone 5. And just based on minimum temperatures over the last 20 years, the average minimum temperatures. So it is getting warmer. You go to Windsor, they're actually at growth zone 7, and that's much warmer. Much, much warmer, just because of what's going on with Lake Huron. So, you know, there's a lot of evidence, weather evidence, that the environment is changing. I talked about the golden rain trees. Believe me, those are nowhere near their normal range. We moved them easily 400 miles north of where they usually grow, and they are doing just fine. They're very happy. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of attention to that. Anytime you get the timber lines beginning to change, anytime you get conifer forests growing 10 miles north of where they used to grow in northern Canada, things are changing.
Mm-hmm. So along those lines, we've heard about various bark beetles and so forth also moving north. Are there threats of that sort that would be of concern in this area?
There are always concerns with that kind of thing. Our biggest concerns, of course, is with exotics that the trees have never experienced. But as you place any tree under stress, either because it's getting warmer or drier or whatever, it is more susceptible to successful disease and insect attack. And so, you know, we are having more health problems with the trees. And it's because of that.
Thank you.
Well, on that very cheerful note then, well, thank you very much for coming and sharing with us this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.